Good afternoon. It is fantastic to be here, and I'm honored to welcome all of you to the first discussion in a series of 5 post-COVID-19 perspectives for architecture in South Africa. My name is Hermie Delpoort, and I'm from the STADIO School of Architecture and Spatial Design. So welcome to our first session. Really glad that you are joining us. There can be no doubt that COVID-19 has impacted all of us and presented us with a new normal and all the uncertainties that come with that. The pandemic has brought into sharp focus the social, spatial, and environmental inequalities that exist in our society and in our cities, especially so in South Africa. As architects, we need to seize this opportunity to reinstate the importance of design thinking, not as a nice to have, but as an essential component of creating responsive and appropriate architecture. Our special skill is to translate issues and ideas into built form through the design process. How will this pandemic shape the future of urban design and our architectural thinking and practices? To address this question, the School of Architecture and Spatial Design at STADIO, OpenArchitecture, and the Architectural Education Forum Africa decided to collaborate on a series of 5 online discussions. The School of Architecture and Spatial Design is currently under development. STADIO Holdings is an investment company in private higher education with 6 institutions and already over 30,000 students. 4 of these institutions are consolidating into the STADIO Higher Education Institute, which will be launched at the end of October. The School of Architecture and Spatial Design will soon start offering short courses, and our first formal qualifications, a higher certificate and a Bachelor of Architecture will, if all goes as planned, be launched in 2021. Our courses will be offered in a hybrid, blended way, full-time and part-time. OpenArchitecture was the first of the South African Institute of Architects transformation projects aligned to skills development, to address the educational and structural shortcomings of the traditional full-time model of architectural education. CPUT was the first university to collaborate with OpenArchitecture, and the successful 6-year pilot was concluded at the end of 2019, when the part-time blended BTech in architectural technology was replaced by the advanced diploma. The program was offered online to students supported through office-based mentorship and occasionally brochure sessions on campus. The Architectural Education Forum Africa, or the AEFA, was founded in 2014 as the Architectural Education Forum to create a platform for architectural educators to share ideas, collaborate through research, and to discuss current issues in architectural education. The AEF was the outcome of a symposium on architectural education hosted by the Wits School of Architecture and Planning in early 2014 under the leadership of Ariane Janse van Rensburg. The focus of the AEFA is on architectural education that is relevant for Africa and especially sub-Saharan Africa. For our first perspective, how has COVID-19 impacted how we address urban development and the city? Our chair is Professor Lone Paulsen, the Program Director of OpenArchitecture. Professor Paulsen graduated from the University of Natal in Durban with a Bachelor of Architecture and a Master's in Town and Regional Planning. After teaching and practicing in Durban, she joined the School of Architecture and Planning at Wits University in 1991, where she served as Assistant Dean for the Built Environment Disciplines and Director of the Architecture Program. In 2013, she was appointed Program Director of OpenArchitecture. Lone has published widely and acted as a consultant to the City of Johannesburg, the Gauteng and National Departments of Housing, and various residents' associations. She has served on the judging panels of architectural and urban design competitions, adjudicated the Institute of Architects Merit Awards locally and in Zimbabwe, and often acts as an external examiner and critic for architectural, urban design, housing, and planning programs. Before I hand over to Lone to introduce our participants for this session, I just want to remind you of some house rules. If you have any questions, please put it in the chat. We will collate the questions and share them. If there are many questions, we will unfortunately not be able to get to everything, but you're welcome to write to us afterwards. Each presenter will present about 10 minutes, and then we will have a discussion session at the end. We are welcome to participate. And your certificates for attendance will be mailed to you in due course. Thank you very much, and I hand over now to Lone. Thank you, Lone, to introduce our participants and to chair the session.
Thanks very much, Hami, and yeah, welcome to everyone. It's really great to see that we've actually got, I think, about 75 people joining us now, so that's really nice for the first time. Just before I introduce the speakers, I just want to talk a little bit about how we've conceptualized this webinar series. We've focused it specifically on South Africa because we feel that it's important that we actually have a discussion, locally about the context in which we're in, and the sort of impact that the pandemic has had on urban design and architectural professions. And the aim is to stimulate conversations and debates around current issues related to architectural practice and education. So the conceptual idea of the 5 perspectives is therefore to look at challenges and opportunities for design thinking at 3 different scales, and then to explore how this might impact on practice in education. So perspective 1 is at the scale of the city, and it's how has COVID impacted the city and how do we address urban development. Perspective 2 is at the scale of the district, precinct, and neighborhood, and how has COVID impacted urban design and how we live, work, and play. Perspective 3 then moves to the scale of the complex or the building, and how has COVID impacted how we create responsive architecture. And then perspective 4 is how has this impacted on how we might practice architecture. And finally, the last webinar is how COVID has impacted on how we teach and learn architecture. In framing each of the 5 perspectives, we've invited 3 panelists with different backgrounds and experiences to present their ideas in the hope of stimulating and provoking a broader conversation. Not to find a specific solution, but rather to open up the thinking around how we might move forward progressively under the challenging circumstances that the pandemic has brought into focus. The advantage of having an online event is that we can include panelists and audiences from across the country. And in doing this, we realized what a wealth of knowledge and expertise we have in South Africa. And it was really difficult to hone in on who to invite to participate as panelists. So if you haven't been included, don't feel insulted. It really is that what we've tried to do is include perspectives from different fields, experiences, and contexts. And it is now my great pleasure and honor to introduce Rayana Musaji, who I've known for many years and worked with in Johannesburg. Rayana is the founder and owner of the Barefoot Facilitator, a company committed to transforming the way in which we relate to ourselves, space, and planet. Rayana holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in Education from Wits University. She's been a community activist and a city councillor in the city of Johannesburg. She led the team that delivered Reabaya, but in February 2013, she resigned from her position as member of the mayoral committee to pursue her passion for transformation and unity. Rayana, welcome, and please share your screen and deliver your ideas that we can discuss later. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lone, for that warm invitation, and always challenging to be speaking to an audience who know a lot more about the topic than you do. And I've opted, in fact, today to just use a single graphic slide to share with you some thoughts in relation to the post-COVID city, but really just gonna ask us all right now, all 80 of us who are on this call, to just spend a moment connecting with your body. So before we go into the head space and a lot of conversation space, just to spend some time taking 3 deep breaths together. So let's breathe in. and out. 2. And 3. So when Lone invited me to present in this session, there were many possibilities about what to talk about. But my work in the last couple of years has really brought me to this notion of the importance of the inner architecture of the built environment professional. And because we live in cities that are such fast-moving spaces, and I think one of the things that COVID has done that is something to, in fact, be celebrated is to force us all to slow it down a tad, to withdraw somewhat from the external world, and to be able to spend more time in our own interiors. And I think that that's a very important springboard, in fact, for transformation of space. Because this pandemic has really given us an opportunity to think through the interaction and engagement between ourselves as practitioners and communities, ourselves and the natural environment in our cities, and in many South African cities, the ability to access natural spaces and natural environment is severely compromised, particularly for people living in informality and stressed conditions. And in fact, the inaccessibility of a natural environment further adds dimensions to stress. And to refocus on the things we often take for granted, spaces for young children and families that you see on the graphic, and the ability of built environment professionals to actually create spaces of connection and beauty in our cities. And so really inviting us all to consciously reflect on our practice. And of course, architecture is an amazing profession that brings together hands and head and heart, and I hope soul too. But I've certainly found, and I'm going to focus now on the 2 images that you see on the graphic, one being a publication by the South African Cities Network on what's called BAIT, the Built Environment Integration Task Team. And that magazine is actually a profile on individual built environment professionals and what gets them up in the morning. So these are people working in public sector. What gets them up in the morning? What about their own life experiences has shaped how they want to be in relation to their professional practice? And some really fascinating stories about where people grow up, about what's motivated them to enter the built environment profession, and how they see themselves contributing to the transformation of our cities. So I think COVID-19 has created the opportunity for us to reimagine a range of things. And I'm not sure alone that South African cities have used the opportunity of the pandemic to substantially reimagine and action some of that reimagination in this time. So I think globally you've seen movements to free up street space, the biggest public space in our cities, the biggest shared spaces in our cities, which pre-COVID were dedicated to cars. And quite honestly, I think given our lack of movement on this issue during the pandemic, is likely to take us back to a one-person, one-car culture that is choking our cities in more ways than one and compromising our quality of life. So I think just from the work we've done with the South African Cities Network practitioners, real insights on the importance of getting back in touch with your inner architecture. The second one, which Lone asked me specifically to reference then, is a little bit on the public transport story, or part of the public transport story in Johannesburg, and the advent of the Rea Vaya BRT project. But I want to focus specifically again on the inner architecture, because there are untold stories about that project of minibus taxi leaders together with city leaders coming together on a Wednesday morning, positive visualization, meditation, breathing, measuring our lives and lives lost to enable that project from one Wednesday morning to another. The ability to take art out into public space through public transport infrastructure. And in fact, the design of those stations being very much co-creation between built environment professionals and community members. So if you look at the original renderings that were submitted for Rea Vaya stations and what was finally put down on the streets of Johannesburg, that was very much the result of a conversation in the A-level lecture theatre at Metro Centre in Johannesburg of community members who have no knowledge of built environment practice, but were able to bring in elements for what they wanted to see in this city project. And so really just to reiterate that the inner architecture of each person on this call in how you go out and do the work you're doing in the communities that you're working with. And last week, Lone, I had the opportunity to be facilitating a South African planning law conference. And an input on the national building regulations got me really, really concerned, because our inability to acknowledge the role of informality in South African cities, whether that's informal traders, informal human settlements, informal modes of transport, means that often we're talking about planning cities in a way that excludes over 50% of people who live here. And what COVID has really shown is the ability for communities to break through the barriers that are normally considered the issues that separate them. And whilst, yes, COVID has shown up all of the design flaws in our cities, it's also shown the power of the human spirit and solidarity and connection. So the establishment of the community action networks and a range of other organizations have shown people's ability to rise to the occasion, be resilient, but have raised massive issues around food security and around the models that we pursue and how relevant they are for a South African context. So I'm really keen to be in conversation with colleagues, and maybe just a final reminder that often when we are conceiving of city spaces, we're thinking about young, fit adults. We're not seeing the creation of our cities from the eyes of a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old. And that in fact, our investment in creating cities that respond to the needs of a wide diversity of people who live here and who occupy space, we're provided with the opportunity to turn our cities into massive classrooms that become spaces where children can be curious, they can explore, they can learn, they can experiment. And I think what COVID-19 does is it allows us all to think about fundamentally transformed cities and our inner architecture to enable that transformation to happen. So Lone, I'll pause there and then really want to save more time to be in conversation with people.
Thank you very much, Rihanna, for that insight and reminder that we actually are designing cities for people. And in our kind of striving to provide grand designs and grand ideas, we sometimes forget that we're actually designing for people. So I think that's hugely important. And I think I agree that COVID has kind of brought that really into the forefront, you know, to remind us that that's actually what we're doing. I'm going to go straight to the second speaker, and we'll follow on straight to the third panelist, and then leave time for discussions. I see that Hami is reminding people to post comments or questions in the chat box so that we can collect them for the end. Okay, so our second panelist is Richard Ballard. Since 2015, Richard has been employed at the position of principal researcher in the Gauteng City Region Observatory. His academic training is in human geography and development studies. He conducts research on various aspects of urban transformation, including race and class segregation and desegregation, state housing policy, and private developers. So Richard is going to take us to the kind of spatial configuration of our cities. Richard, welcome, and please share your screen.
Thanks very much, Lone, and thanks to everyone. I've tried turning on my screen, but it says I can't. It probably, my camera, it says that I can't, and that probably doesn't matter because you'll be looking at the slides. This presentation has origins about 2 years ago when we were invited by the Gauteng provincial government to prepare a series of thematic papers as they were coming to the end of their 5-year term at the time in 2019. There we go, I can start my video. So this was a thematic paper on spatial trends in Gauteng. And when I was invited to speak here today, I said, my response was that I'd prefer to speak on some of these findings that don't speak directly to COVID, but do allow us to get a sense of long-term trends over a many-decade period. And as we go through them, the work is really just beginning to think about how we can possibly model the impact of COVID on these various trends that we can talk about and identify. So the way in which we might start this presentation is to refer back to the National Development Plan in 2012, which had the following statement: by 2050, South Africa will no longer have poverty traps in townships, workers isolated on the periphery of cities, inner cities controlled by slumlords and crime, sterile suburbs with homes surrounded by high walls and electric fences, households spending 30% or more of their time, energy, and money on daily commuting, decaying infrastructure with power blackouts, undrinkable water, potholes, and blocked sewers, violent protests, gridlocked roads and unreliable public transport, new public housing in barren urban landscapes, new private investments creating exclusive enclaves for the rich, fearful immigrant communities living in confined spaces. It's an interesting point to start with because obviously these are ideals which we can all relate to and think about, but they are ideals and we really do have to think about the mechanisms that produce urban space within our cities and what points of leverage we might have over those quite big processes that are unfolding around us. The first of 6 trends I will work through quite quickly in the 10 or so minutes that I have is it relates to migration. Trend number 1 is that between 2017 and 2018, Gauteng's population was growing at around about 7,000 people per week. So just to get into a little bit of detail there, Gauteng's population at present is 15.5 million people. Gauteng was expected, this is before COVID was around in our world, but was modeled to grow by 362,000 people over the 12-month period that we're currently in. So that's about 7,000 people a week. You can see that municipalities within Gauteng are growing at different rates. Joburg is by far the fastest. Stats SA estimates that Gauteng will have grown by 1.8 million people in the 5-year period between 2016 and 2021. So that's a 5-year period, a growth of 1.8 million people. How might we imagine that? One way of putting this into perspective is to note that Soweto's population was around 1.8 million people in 2017. So as a metaphor, you could say that Gauteng's population is growing by a Soweto every 5 years, obviously diffused across the entire urban space. Recent modeling suggests that we were set to grow from the current 15.5 million people to around 19 million people over the next decade. So in other words, we would have to accommodate an additional 3.5 million people by 2030. Second trend I wanted to touch on is that along with growth in population, the sheer size of Gauteng urban areas is growing every year. So the map that you have in front of you is of urban land cover in Gauteng. All areas that are shaded white are non-urban areas. So for example, agriculture and nature reserves. The light gray area was the built-up land area in 1990. The yellow areas are those that were converted to urban land between 1990 and 2000. And the green areas were those that were added between 2000 and 2013. So the yellow and green areas essentially show us urban sprawl over the last 3 decades. And the broad trend here is that urban sprawl is slowing down. So between 1990 and 2000, we were converting about 43 square kilometers each year into urban land use, so those yellow areas. Since 2000, it has slowed to 17 square kilometers per year, the green areas. So we're adding to our cities every year, but less by area each year. The third trend is that Gauteng's urban areas are densifying, but this density, as we well know, is uneven. So most cities in the world are becoming less dense over time. And what this means is that people used to be more tightly packed together in the past than they are today in most cities. The Gauteng city region is an unusual case of the opposite happening, which is that people are becoming more tightly packed together over time. And one of the reasons for this is that our cities were so sparsely spread out in the first place. What all this means is the additional population that we have been experiencing through population growth and net migration tends to be accommodated in long-established urban areas rather than those new areas on the fringe. Of course, this density is not spread evenly around the province. You can see from the table on the bottom right, 50% of Gauteng's residents live on just 2.4% of the province's land. And those are the 2 darker shaded areas in various bits of the province. people, half of the Gauteng's population living on just 2% of the province's land. This level of density occurs in CBD areas, but also in townships around the province. Everyone else, the other 50%, are living in much more spread out ways. So as we know, the city of Joburg has an explicit intention to densify along transit corridors to create denser areas between Soweto, the CBD, and Alex. These are incredibly important policy directions, but I think we can see from this map where the real centers of gravity are in the parts of the city region, and that they tend to be located in working class parts of the city region. The fourth trend I wanted to touch on is the quantity of residential buildings that has been built. And we can measure it thanks to remote sensing techniques, certainly not done by myself, but by others, that in 2001, we had something in the region of 2.1 million residential buildings in Gauteng. And by 2016, this had gone up to 3.4 million residential buildings of all types. So I need to be clear here that these numbers refer to buildings and not units. Some buildings may have many units in them. So one new building may be anything from a block of flats with hundreds of units to a backyard room. And across all types of residential buildings, we now have around 3.4 million residential buildings. You can see that the biggest category of residential buildings is freehold formal houses. So that's the blue section at the bottom. And this includes anything from a big house to a low-cost house. The next most important categories are informal housing. And it's interesting to see here how in 2001, there were more structures in informal settlements than there were backyard dwellings. By 2016, the situation had reversed. There are more backyard dwellings than there were structures in informal settlements. So we can map this. We can see where new buildings are being constructed. You can see that along the northern fringes of Johannesburg and the southern eastern fringes of Pretoria, we know this to be a belt of a lot of production of gated communities, of malls, of office spaces, and so on. You can also see the intensification of space in and around townships all around the province. This is where the real construction has been taking place. A lot of it is that intensification through backyarding. The fifth trend, I'm aware that I'm on 10 minutes, so I'm going to move through the last two as fast as I can, is that people are building different kinds of residential settlements in different parts of the city region. So there are some overlaps between different kinds of property markets, but very often they simply don't overlap, and they're quite far apart from one another. So if we take just 3 examples of different housing types, we can see how they're distributed very differently across the city region. The green areas are the Gauteng province's human settlements projects. So there's a large number of them that are fairly close to township spaces or adjacent to township spaces. Not always, but that's quite often the case. And we just heard about a new one that is being constructed there, which is not represented. Most gated communities, these are the blue areas, are located nowhere near these new human settlement activities. They're located on this ribbon that I was referring to earlier that we all know about. The darker gray dots are all informal dwellings. So again, a different kind of accommodation being built in a different part of the city region. One of the things, of course, that is going on is that the property market is highly segmented. The darker shaded areas are those areas, we're looking just at Johannesburg this time, that are the most expensive properties in the city. So starting at Westcliff, going up to Sandton, and on either side. Much of the northern suburbs, as we know, is the next most expensive part of the city region. And you can see how the city is segregated through property prices, essentially. So a lot of what we see playing out is a filtration based on property price. The final trend I wanted to mention is that income inequality remains spatialized and is not necessarily improving. And we've done various things to try and measure this. This is a fairly complex exercise, but I can say that the 4 different shades on this map represent whether or not average income for a ward is getting closer to or further away from the provincial average. And what we're seeing here is those pale green areas were wards where the income level was above the provincial average in 2000 and was still above the provincial average at 2011, but had gotten closer to it. So in other words, it was converging. Those tan-colored areas were wards where the average income was below the provincial income level in 2001, and by 2011 was getting closer to the provincial average. So those two, the areas with those shading are essentially converging on the provincial average income, household income. The darker green areas and the red areas are a more worrying story. So the darker green areas were rich wards that got a lot richer over that same period. And those red areas are wards that were poor and drifted away from the provincial average. They got poorer in relative terms. So we can see how spatialized inequality in some respects was getting worse over that particular period. Here's another way of thinking about things: the number of unemployed people per square kilometer, incredible intensities in township spaces in particular. So I will finish with this slide, which is really the takeaway points. Every time I've tried to think through what COVID is doing to these trends, I sort of give up because it starts to seem quite speculative and quite difficult to nail down. But I think we can certainly think through some scenarios around migration, around unemployment, around the production of residential stock, and how those trends that we've been seeing might get inflected by what has been playing out since the crisis began. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for that very informative presentation. I think that, I mean, one of the really valuable things with the GCRO is that it is compiling all of this incredibly valuable data that helps to inform us in an intelligent way about the kinds of decisions that we need to do. And what I particularly like about all those maps, and I have a link that gathers them every time they're produced, is that it, for people like us who are visual, the urban designers and architects, is that it really shows it visually in a spatial layout, so that we understand where things are rubbing up against each other and where things are kind of coexisting in a different way. And I think obviously what is clear is that the segregated city is being perpetuated through various means, despite the fact that you know, legislation has disappeared. But I think the role of data, and also that architects and to a lesser extent urban designers don't often engage with this data and really understand that how the interventions that they're doing really fit into the bigger picture of the city. So for me, this is very valuable information, and I'm sure there will be lots of questions about it as well. I see somebody's already asking where it comes from, and perhaps you could answer that in the chat box. So thank you again. And I will now introduce the last panelist for today, Geshi Karu Sabina, who I've also known for many years and worked with on a number of different projects. Geshi works in several capacities, working at what she now realizes is the intersection between people, place, and technological change, focusing on the global south. She's currently an associate with South African Cities Network, an adjunct professor at the University of Cape Town's African Centre for Cities, a visiting research fellow at the Wits School of Governance, a global faculty member of Singularity Universe, and a curator of the Emergence Network. She's also involved in writing and editorial roles for a few international futures, innovation, and planning publications. She holds a bachelor's degree in computer science and sociology from COE, a master's degrees in architecture and urban design and urban planning from UCLA, and a PhD in urban planning innovation system studies from WITS. Previously, Geshe worked with South African Cities Network, National Treasury, HSRC, the CSIR, and the UCLA Advanced Policy Institute. Geshe also served as a panelist on the Ministerial Task Team on the Fourth Industrial Revolution, an expert advisor on the Presidential Task Team on Land Reform, the South African Council of Planners, and the Johannesburg Development Agency. So you will see that there is a vast range of experiences there. And Geshe, if I can ask you to upload your presentation and take us through your ideas.
Thanks, Lone, and thank you for having me this evening. As you can probably tell from that introduction and the range of things I've been mucking around with, I'm probably not a traditional practicing a built environment professional of any kind anymore. And when Lone first approached me about this session, my concern was that people might be looking for more traditional answers or direction around the impact or roles of the profession given COVID. But she assured me that she was comfortable with my kind of journeying, which is, I think, what I'll try and talk about today. And so I titled this presentation Unvisioning. It's a version of a talk I gave, part of a talk anyway, that I gave last month at the University of Free State. And I'm using part of it, but to tell a slightly different story, because when asked this question, how I think COVID impacts upon the professions, I feel as though what feels important is in a way similar to what Richard was just saying, you know, to sort of look at whether there are more than what I called COVIDian shifts that might be required or reflections that might be required. So like the Sankofa, perhaps the need to look back before we can move forward, as much as we're all keen to move forward from this horrible year and this horrible place we're in, perhaps the space for reflection is what's called for. So that's the basis for asking, you know, is there some unvisioning we need to do? And okay, are the slides moving? Okay, there we go. So I start here only to show that, you know, on the 15th of May, I was asked to give a talk that reflected on COVID and the impacts of COVID. And you'll see in the top bit there that just a quick Google search in 0.42 seconds gave me 3 billion results. If that number is 3 billion, I'm not very good at numbers anymore. But on the second one, then in August, when I was asked to speak on a similar topic, there were many, many more. And of a very different nature. So the nature of concern appeared to have gone from sort of curiosity and inconvenience, perhaps annoyance, anger, fear about COVID, to really being quite concerned about policy and livelihood issues. And I think this kind of worrying binaries we saw beginning to be painted, and I think still are being, between the economy and health, as the one has to choose between one or the other. But the point being that many, many people are thinking about these issues all over the world. And there are many speculations and methods, you know, that have been proposed for that. I'll come back to that. But there's been this shift, this progressive dawning, you know, from the idea that we were just on a brief break to some kind of realization that, wow, this is actually serious for the long haul. And what does it mean for us? Already booked a piece about this stuff. People are trying to sense make, people are trying to predict, manage, control, work through, push back, all of this. And of course, there are many of us who are just wondering what the heck is going on, and, you know, should we be on pause, or, you know, people like talking about new normals. And so all of these, you know, are valid concerns. I think what's interesting about it, I think, is the realization that there will be changes. And those changes may include the kind of, our reactions, I guess, could include the kind of checking out and waiting until things get better. So we've got some retro trends kicking in, like the drive-in movie. The pandemic is also accelerating a number of trends. So, you know, the ongoing transformations, for example, of the film industry, production, distribution, consumption were already changing. So while all of you might be stuck on your couch watching Netflix rather than going to the theater, that's a trend we are told that was already happening, and it's paralleled in many other urban areas. If you think about trends in retail, how you're shopping for groceries now, not necessarily something new, but something that's scaled up significantly. If you look at changes in the airline industry, the mail service, office space and real estate, there are a lot of changes that are happening that one in hindsight might recognize were already happening have just scaled up in ways that's really impacting on whole industries and sectors. The question I go to from there is, what does change mean and for whom? Now, for some of us, when we talk about post-COVID, the conversation is really about this guy, right? And there's some really serious issues here. So what does COVID and post-COVID mean for healthcare infrastructure, for social distancing and how we design for it? What is the virtualization, if it carries forward a sort of mean? Richard's telling us about some of the urban sprawl decreasing. We've all been concerned also about just, the scale of urban population and urbanization. Is that going to be reversed, like some people are saying, empty freeways and empty parking lots, deurbanization? We're concerned about economic impact, sector impacts, crises in education, the mental health. These are all really, really, really important issues. But I think there's another side of that that looks more like this when we start thinking about the global south and many spaces in our contexts, where perhaps the concerns and the questions are a little bit different. The conversation about change for the majority poor really begins to be confronted by, some of these things that we're all aware of, sort of really high densities, the low incomes, the precarious conditions. So if we look at the Treasury forecasts that tell us that just the lockdown period probably led to job losses that could go up to 1.8 million, 3 million jobs at risk. We've already lost 3,000 formal non-agricultural sector jobs in the first quarter of the year, 40% of vacancies in the year, unemployment is up, could rise to 50%, so all of these things. This is probably a reality that's an exacerbated reality for many people. And so when we begin asking about what the solutions are to those issues for contexts like this, this is the typical list that one finds from articles, from research that's being done. And the question I like to ask about this is, is this something new? Was it the agenda we had already? Are these not the things we've been trying to do and struggling through, well, at least for my 2 decades of my career? And so rather than save our souls, the SOS begins to sound a bit like, okay, it's the same old story. So is post-COVID simply going to be about snapping back to trying to deal with the same challenges in the same ways that we were? And if we remember just a few months ago, we were busy considering the presidential dream of our fourth industrial revolution fueled Wakanda, right? Yeah, this is what we thought the issue and the agenda was. Even then, I think for many of us, and there were articles and debates about this, there was some suspicion that this might be faulty footing, that the logic might not be quite right. In a way, Corona has just sort of been a fire under this, So is our good modern future one of either being Dubai or Wakanda? Or is this perhaps even less believable and less relevant in a post-COVID age? So all of this to say, or to come back to this question of, so what is our role and how is COVID impacting on that? And I'd like to offer the way that I'm thinking about it. Certainly, I'm glad Lone said we didn't have to have answers because I don't have any to offer. But I've been playing with this line of thinking, and I'm hoping it contributes to the discussion and to your own thinking as professionals. So if you excuse the kind of business school cliche, you've all probably seen this diagram, which talks about, the tip of the iceberg and the old story around the sort of Titanic. So, and my question is, are we perhaps looking at something similar to this? So there's this feature on the water, and that's an observable, that's the headline, that's an observable behavior. There's a water line and we can't see below that. And underlying that, of course, are much bigger, more significant issues that one might need to engage. And this has been used as a model for thinking about organizational culture. But for me, what I've been interested about it really is the causal layered analysis work of Sohail and Ayatollah that I've been looking at for a few years now. And I think I find really useful, for some of you, it'll look more familiar, probably related to the idea of theory U. And this idea of going deeper and beginning to understand what's happening in all of these different horizons. And my reason for sharing it today, in fact, is not so much to sort of train you on how to think about these, but this idea that perhaps the issue we see on the surface is underlaid by systemic issues that sustain that. In the world of futuring, we might talk about how we look at these kind of pestle or steep trends. Richard has shared a few trends with us, and there are these reasons or underlying issues. But that if you went deeper, one gets into issues of culture. And if you really went to the bottom of it, there are these sort of informing images about who we think we are and what we think is happening and what we imagine to be alternatives. and that getting into that locale is very important if you want to get onto a transformative swing where you begin to define new cultures, new ways of doing things, new possibilities, new indicators. I'm going to jump to the next slide because what I really want to talk about in terms of this, you know, how we get from that sort of empirical layer down to a more critical reflection, which I feel is the space that I'm in as a professional, is to come back to the question of role. Now, I think, and this is a question in a way that I'm putting to you, is that there are these levels, the level of the event, the level of the pattern, the underlying, and then the paradigm. And at some stage, I think I felt that it was only about going deep. And my own work recently has been getting into sort of this paradigmatic imagination layer. In fact, Teresh Govender and I have been doing some work on that, and we'll have a session next week on Tuesday on smarter cities and imagination. So it's been this issue of sort of how do we look at representation and the responsibility of urban design professionals perhaps to offer interesting and different representations that are paradigmatically different. But as I was thinking and speaking to Lone, what I really got to thinking is that perhaps it's not just about saying everybody needs to be working on that level. In fact, it can't be that. But it's saying, do we need perhaps to make sense of what all of these different levels mean and understand that we may all be working at multiple levels. We may be choosing to work at different levels, but they're all important in some way or form because there are events that are happening, you know, even, and COVID is a good illustration of this, where certainly one needs those reactions to things that are real. You know, if people are hungry and starving, it's not the time to talk about what paradigm are they in. You need to address that, and that's a valid engagement to have. However, there are those who then believe that we've got to work at the pattern or the redesign level within an existing paradigm, and perhaps there needs to be room for that too. And of course, we've accused ourselves in South Africa for not doing enough in terms of just implementing the good we know or intend. So there's work on that level. And I suppose as built environment professionals, one indeed might be working in trying to do better just at that level. I think at the level of reframing, there are people who are beginning to create those cultural shifts, really questioning and rethinking how we do things, trying to reframe things. And that surely is possibly a relevant role. I think for me, it's been to get into this role of the reimagination and the unvisioning, like I mentioned. And I think perhaps no longer as precious about whether that's the most important or not. I think it's this appreciation. There are the different roles, but I thought that this representation might be useful and interesting for all of you in thinking perhaps about where you've sat and whether post-COVID means something for you in terms of other spaces you might occupy. That's really my main message for today, but I'll go quickly through just a couple of more slides because I wanted to share, now that I've mentioned I'm working down here, just to very briefly show some of what I've been thinking and talking about. So in the space of really rethinking that bottom layer, I had cause to develop some thinking about what I meant and what I began to think were some of the issues that might change there. And so one of the pieces of work I had done was this around what I saw as 3 significant shifts that need to happen at that base level. And the one was around the shifting of imagination. How do we really get, and what methodologies do we use to really get ourselves to thinking new things? And the space that's taken me into is the space of futures literacy, understanding how we anticipate and why we anticipate the way we do, why that might limit us from imagining other possibilities, expanding the menu of ideas rather than limiting the menu through, for example, our representations. And so that's an area of work that I'm quite interested in exploring, at least intellectually. The area of inclusion. So I think Rihanna actually, when she talks about inner architecture and talks about co-creation, I feel these are words we recognize and we know that often we are the few purporting to do for the many, but how do we work in different ways? We talk participation in South Africa, we struggle to do it. What might that look like? How do we really tap into the genius and the survival instincts of so many? And then finally, how do we institutionalize different ways of doing? So we can think different things, but we possibly can't really do new things if we continue to have rule bases and systems that are set up for something quite different. So how do we really reimagine institutions as well? And so these are the 3 kind of propositions that I've been exploring at that bottom space. And it was partly inspired by this, which is, perhaps I should have gone slower through that. You know, this idea that that we tend to think, we are told by Jim Data and others, Jim Data is a futurist from Hawaii, in 4 typical archetypical ways about the future. We tend to think the future will either be more of the same, so business as usual, projected forward, and we represent those things, or we tend to be the kinds, the types who think that everything's going to shit and it's going to be horrible, and so there's this kind of dystopic future. There's this other idea that we might become sensible and all do better. It may not be great, but we can discipline ourselves into being more sustainable and surviving on the planet. And then I often say, depending on what you're smoking, there are often these other views that for some reason always look like some version of Bucky's Dome that are meant to be the transformative future. And what we are told by, and so those are the four archetypes: the continued growth, the collapse, the disciplined future, or the transformative future. And the issue with these is that often one doesn't even realize that we are either looking at things either just getting better or worse, things being the same or different. And we tend to populate or limit the menu of the future within these representations. So some of the work around imagination is really about how do you get past that and how do you create processes that do that. Otherwise, we risk doing this. I love this cartoon from SDI in India. And it was this idea apparently for the National Habitat Day, a cartoonist put this out because one was basically talking about moving from one building typology that you don't like into just, reconfiguring it. So, really this idea of moving chairs on the Titanic and thinking you're doing something different. And this scares me, this idea that perhaps this is all we do sometimes really, really, really scares me. And so, how do we do something different from this? So the other piece of research, and this I won't say much about, it will take too much time, and it's linked to this idea of decolonizing, is how do we do a different kind of action research? How do we engage in different ways that move beyond traditional kind of preparing or planning within an existing paradigm to things that really allow for novelty, for different direction, the kinds of things that nobody entertains because when you raise them, people ask you, okay, so what are you suggesting? What's the answer? What's the, and if you can't answer that, then somehow your journey is invalidated. And I think that's actually what decolonization means. I know a lot of our institutions are struggling to make sense of that. For me, it's not that difficult. It's talking about what are the things that really allow for different possibility, different imaginary, and aren't constrained either because of our methods or our ability to imagine that things could be different. So these are the kinds of things that interest me right now. And this one I mentioned earlier is some of the work that I've been doing with Teresh around looking at the space of representation. I encourage you to attend this session next week. So that's just by way of sharing some of the kind of research that I'm interested in. And coming back finally to this question, therefore, of what's our role and how is it impacted on, in a post-COVID world? I think we're called upon to be much more varied and fluid, and maybe we've always been called upon to do this, but perhaps it's clearer now. The idea that we need to be much more contextual and engaged, and I think Rihanna spoke to that quite nicely. The idea that we need to, as I just suggested, expand options rather than limiting them simply based on our comfort or our training. How do we really look into doing things differently? Humility and openness, that's a tough thing to ask of professions like ours, where in fact humility is not at their core in my view. But how do we imagine that we could practice in ways that are much more open and that see our role as being one that requires humility and learning and the taking of responsibility for what it is that we do. So that's kind of what I wanted to share today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. I think I went a few minutes over, apologies for that, but thank you for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Geshe, for your usual provocative ideas and forcing us to really think outside of what is our normal kind of comfort zone. I think this idea of, what does change mean and for whom is a really, really important question, because that's really, the purpose of kind of everything that we do. And then the whole idea of unvisioning, because I think that when we have done visioning in the past, and you spoke about this as well, is that, the way that we represent, the way that we vision things tends to be very similar. I mean, whether the kind of drawings are from the south or from the north or the west or the east or whatever, they tend to project a very similar kind of outcome. And I think that that's really limiting ourselves, because I think that each context has value and richness and cultural elements and context and histories that should really be informing the way that we move forward, rather than trying to project this kind of universal future for all of our cities. So I think that that's really important. I kind of like the idea of the sort of tip of the iceberg, because, you know, it's what are we seeing and what's actually going on? You know, because that's the thing is, you know, how do we actually know everything else? We tend to be in our own little boxes. And I think your various ideas about imagine, inclusion, institutionalize are really important. Because you talk about decolonizing, I think the biggest thing is to decolonize our own minds, because we tend to work with the same things over and over again. We think we know the answers, and we think we can project them, and we think we can share them and get everybody on board with it. But we actually need to kind of unclutter our own minds and you know, yeah, imagine differently, include different ideas, and then start to make those, you said institutionalized, but to sort of make those the way forward, you know, that people are thinking in a different way. So I think very, very useful provocation, and I hope that it will also elicit a number of questions. So others are collecting questions in the chat box, but I really just wanted to kick off maybe with a couple of questions myself, because for me, the COVID lockdowns have really brought into focus the interconnectedness of everything and how interdependent we all are on each other. You know, anything that affects one personally affects someone else upstream or downstream. And these are things that we were perhaps not as aware of before, as we sort of focused on our own little lives and how we engage with the city without considering the repercussions for others. And yeah, I think, you know, the various stages of the lockdown, which sort of allowed certain things back in, made you realize, you know, the things that we all take for granted, and that we don't often think about others that are not in our kind of immediate circle. And I think that this somehow forced us to realize, you know, what was it like for the domestic worker, you know, as opposed to just ourselves, you know, what were those long queues of people who were trying to get to work on taxis that were limited. And so there's a whole plethora of things that have just become incredibly visible. So I guess the question is really, how do we negotiate this complexity? And maybe I'd like to ask each of you to kind of reflect on each other's presentations, you know, and how they might tie together or contradict each other or whatever else. So I don't know if, Brianna, you'd like to start, and then I'd like to come back to kind of one question to sort of bring it back to the kind of, you know, built environment professions, just thinking through one example. So yeah, just comments from each of you about what's being presented.
Thanks, Lone, and thanks to Richard and Geshe for I think very interesting perspectives. But Lone, just coming back to the idea of the interconnectedness of everything. And I don't know about others on this call, but I've experienced two responses in my immediate circles and like absolutely immediate family around the ability to see your interconnectedness and your behaviors and actions and repercussions on a system, or in fact, a fairly individualistic, fatalistic way of, well, I'll just do what I need to do and, you know, things will happen, and no sense, in fact, of interconnectedness. I posed a question as Geshe was presenting, because I think one of the challenges we've had pre-COVID, and clearly it's ramping up as we're counting job losses, is the ability we have as society to count people's value based on their employment status. So almost if you don't have a job, and a paying job at that, you're a problem, your situation is a problem, you have nothing to contribute that's meaningful. And I think, and I'm not sure that I captured it sufficiently in the way I shared the graphic, Lone, but I think my contention is really that in fact there's too much noise. There's too much noise in the system overall. There's lots of fear, and there's the inability to actually appreciate the pause space that the pandemic is giving us, because in fact, something that was not working is dying. We are experiencing potentially the last breaths of a dying system, and we do have the opportunity to co-create and change. But as long as we, and I mean, it's interesting, you know, I often kind of get the GCRO maps and stats and so forth. And of course, I think data and the ability to interpret data is incredibly important. But I think when we talk about masses of people and urbanization and space, what happens to the human psyche? And I go back to Mayor Masondo, who is, you know, a leader I deeply admire, used to tell us, often ask us, what happens to people's humanity when they come into urban spaces? Because in fact, they become invisible in those spaces. So things that you would not dare do in a remote rural village, because there's a community that holds each other accountable for a range of things that you would so easily do when you arrive in the big city. And I'm particularly interested in our unhealed spaces. I think if we're talking South African context, our cities remain deeply traumatized spaces, let alone people. Spaces hold deep memory and deep trauma. And the fact that this pandemic has been about the inability to breathe, and that our interconnectedness is actually through the power of breath. That the reason why everything feels complex is that the container that we're viewing things from is too small. And we actually have to widen perspective and just look at the possible power of human agency and resilience, and a built environment that actually creates the space for human beings to connect with themselves, with the natural environment, and with each other. And that's, of course, is easier said than done. But I think there have been wonderful examples in this period of that happening, even as we've been locked away. And even in this crazy virtual world, we've been able to connect sometimes more deeply than we do when we meet in person. And so I continue to advocate for pause, spaces of silence, and dropping into the deep intelligence that is inherent in each one of us if we, in fact, give ourselves the space for that intelligence to emerge.
Thanks, Rayani. Richard, comment from you?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about interconnectedness, we can recognize the fact that every society has to confront the question of who it steps in to save and to help sustain, and who it doesn't step in to save and help sustain. Apartheid was very clear on this. It identified a large number of people as surplus and said that they were not part of the urban system. They were not to come to the urban system. They were to reproduce themselves elsewhere, essentially separated from the economic system of cities. The post-apartheid model was one that was intended to be inclusive in the sense that people could come to cities, and was also based on the idea that people could participate economically so that they could sustain themselves and meet their needs in that way. And we know that that was a very limited model. We did research on people in Diepsloot who were building Stain City, which kept touting how great it was that they'd come next door to Stain City because they were giving people jobs, who were earning less than the proposed minimum wage. So people were barely able to get by on the money they were getting, let alone accumulate assets. We did invent some welfare mechanisms to help people. We've invented the child support grant, which, as we know, is vital. A really interesting moment in the pandemic has been the invention of other kinds of grants, in which it was recognized that society needed to step in, literally to help sustain people who otherwise would not be able to make it. And I think that is the question before us as a society, is how we help people who are in peril right now, recognizing that the system that was functioning as at February this year was leaving a lot of people in a state of poverty, and we know that that has only gotten worse. So those are some broad points about interconnection, and I think it's a really vital aspect of imagination, and we've seen repeatedly how those with means are struggling to relate to that point, and I think that's where imagination can play an incredibly important role. And as a society, to imagine and think about the mechanism through which we step in to help sustain people who are struggling. I'll stop there.
Thanks. Jason?
Yeah, I think I'll only comment briefly. I really agree with the previous two comments, that I think with this issue of complexity and interconnectedness, I feel like maybe the bit that I could add is that uncertainty is the other thing I guess we have to embrace and negotiate, and is one of the things that COVID is showing us. And with uncertainty, I think, and Richard, you're talking about these systems we've had that have chosen to control and determine things in a particular way. I'm reminded about, I think 3-4 years ago, I was in a presentation where somebody from UN Habitat was saying that Africa-wide, the informal footprint of most African cities had exceeded the formal footprint, which raised the question, who's planning and designing cities? Now, we may think we are, but clearly we're not keeping up, the pace. And as soon as you acknowledge that, then you begin to recognize. So Paul Jenkins, in one of his papers where he wrote about informality, talked about how the only thing that makes things informal is the elite consensus among those of us who decide that certain things will be formal, acceptable, and we hard code them into the rules. And that comes from a place of certainty and a clarity of vision among the few of us who can be at the table to agree on that, right? And we sort of perpetuate it. And so I think that perhaps the interconnectedness that we are confronted with now is this recognition of what's always been in our faces, which is that we have chosen to embrace things that perhaps are not necessarily reflective of our value, that don't necessarily derive insight from the wonderful maps that GCRO shows us. So we see these things, but we somehow decide whatever and carry on with whatever we're doing. And so perhaps, beginning to understand, I like Rihanna's suggestion that we need to breathe, but maybe that we also need to see. I don't know how many of you reacted to the early days of COVID, but I remember thinking, gosh, I've been saving money and I've been doing certain things that I wonder if they are the most important things to do now, because they may not matter. So that question about what really matters to you, and that sort of a question of a consciousness in not just the things we do as individuals, but the things we perpetuate through rules and through professions, I think is a really important one.
Yeah, no, I agree. Just talking about informality, I was in a webinar, I can't remember, there's so many webinars and so many sessions around at the moment, you can't remember where everything's from. But the one comment that really struck me was that the person who was speaking, I think she was from Kenya, she said, informality is not the opposition. And I thought that was really, really good, because unless we recognize, and as you say, I mean, in a way, if one had to proportion it out, probably the informal city is actually creating the city more than the so-called formal processes, you know, in fact. So yeah, it's how we get those two together. So I had a big question about conceptualizing ideas and things, but I think we've only got 15 minutes left. So I think that if we have time at the end, I'll ask the question, but otherwise I think we should respond to questions from the audience. I see there have been some quite interesting ones in there. So I think, Rami, you've collected them, and perhaps you can just ask the questions, because I've been too busy listening to try and you know, get a handle on all of them. Yeah.
This has been absolutely fascinating, and I've really enjoyed hearing from all of you so far. I'll thank you properly later. We have two, we had comments asking Richard for the data, and we had another question from Lulonke who asked, do the speakers have websites? And Rihanna put something, her website already in, so I don't know if Geshi and Richard also will just want to type in there where they can get more information from you. But then we had two kind of really big questions, one from Abdurazak, who you know, Lone, and from Kevin, who you also know. Abdurazak asks, in Cape Town, the property value of living units in and around the city is too expensive for most citizens to afford to rent or buy. The city is also a great source of income for most. People then travel great distance to the city using a failing public transport system. How do we address this? And then I'm going to give you Kevin's question as well. He asks, any speaker perspectives on the new Mooikloof megacity development?
Who would like to field this? Rihanna, I see you dying to get in there.
I'll come in on the failing public transport system, because I think we really are we have been and continue to be, and seem to be moving into a deepening crisis around the inability to get public transport operators across modes to work together in the interest of the user. So, I mean, I think the further stripping of rail infrastructure that we've seen in this period, the inability, I think I posted as Richard was talking around, you know, yesterday, Mayor Makubo was out showcasing the infrastructure on Rea Vaya Phase 1C. In fact, Johannesburg was supposed to have delivered that in 2016. It's unlikely to open in 2021 at the rate the city is moving. Transport policy, I mean, the minister's got the big kind of transport in Daba at month end. But in the instance of Cape Town, a city government that in fact is continuing to encourage human settlement development apartheid style, and preserving certain areas for wealthy communities. And I want to say that the issue is not just the cost of transport, Abdul Razak, but it's also the implications for households. So when do we begin to measure time use as part of a poverty indicator? And we're absolutely not getting it right. And my sense is that government hasn't played the role it needs to play in convening transport stakeholders over a period of time to start thinking about what an integrated transport system, particularly in our urban centers, look like. And you know, we really haven't invested in walking, in cycling, and where we have, I mean, it's been called into question as wasteful expenditure. Who has voice in the transport narrative is really the one person, one car culture voice. And so really would advocate for some tough conversation and for some tougher action and ability of the three spheres of government to begin to get a sense with transport operators and communities around affordable and accessible transport. And I think we saw the critical role that the minibus taxi sector continues to play in the movement of essential workers. I think COVID has also redefined who the essential workers are. So some of us can be dispensed with quite easily. But I think it really has brought front and center what are the essential services that are required in a city and to keep it moving. And food security in particular, and our inability to factor in food security into urban design. I think there really are opportunities to shift that. So I know I've moved from transport to food security, but I think a whole range of our weaknesses have just been amplified in this period.
Richard, I don't know if you want to take the new mega city question, since you've done some research into these private sector development, big developments.
Sure, with the proviso that I don't know a lot about this case. I think I would make a distinction between projects that are in the path of an expanding urban fringe, which I would think this one is, looking at it, and those that are not in a particularly dynamic part of the city region. So an example which might be interesting to contrast this with is Fontaine, which is an on-again, off-again project that gets talked about a lot. Or Luforeng, which has been built. Both of them are west of Soweto. And planners have spoken about them as a natural extension of Soweto, without any apparent sort of recognition that that's exactly what apartheid planners had in mind, that you could set up townships and then they could indefinitely expand without ever coming into contact with other parts of the city. So something like Cosmo City is very interesting for being away from historical townships and much closer to middle class areas. And I think it is interesting for that. And this may be a similar case of that. I don't know a lot about this particular case, but that is a distinction we might look at. It's a new project that, as I said, wasn't on the map, that the layer that we were working with. So it's interesting how these new projects appear. Gauteng talks about creating 30 new cities. Who knows what that means? And the list that it has doesn't overlap properly with National's list of what it thinks it's doing as major projects, what it used to call catalytic, and now refers through other names like priority development processes. So there's a lot of lists of projects that are supposed, and all of these projects are supposed to be the thing that creates everyone's focus, and yet there's such a lot of split between the different lists that we have in front of us. So it may or may not be a good project in and of itself, but I think we do need to think through how these lists for human settlement projects get devised and how we arrive at a green lighting of a thing like this.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. I mean, I think, there's a lot of things happening independent of each other without really thinking about how they combine to also make the bigger city, But they seem to be focusing on like little cities that somehow might connect and attach to others, but they're not really thinking about them as a complete system. And I must say, when I saw the model of this one, my heart just sank, because I just thought it just looks like every other plan that's ever been done for like new cities, same layout, same. It looks like there's slightly denser topologies and that sort of thing, but actually, that model could have existed in the 1960s or the 1990s or whatever else. I might be speaking completely out of turn here because I haven't looked at it carefully, but just the kind of first impression was same old, So I must say I find it quite disturbing, but also that it's put forward as this answer to all the questions, and then it's like 50,000 units when we actually need 5 million. And we create 42,000 jobs when we actually need 8 million, So it's like, I mean, I kind of sometimes question the rah-rah that goes around that, whether it's really actually achieving that. And Geshi, I don't know if you have a comment about that in terms of like visioning and unvisioning and thinking of the future.
No, I just put in a comment that, yeah, no, I don't know if I really want to comment on that. But speaking of archetypical ideas about what we can do, I just hope we can do better. I hope we can do more. I'm just going to share on the chat as well that actually Edgar Peterson and Phil are going to share from some of the case studies they've been looking at on mega projects, I think in South Africa and other countries on the 19th as part of this urban festival. So that might be something people want to check out if they're interested.
Yeah, I think that would be really good. Homie, I don't know if there are any other questions.
Lone, there is one, but we only have 5 minutes. So I'm going to mention the question, and then I think I'm just going to thank everyone so that we don't go over time, because I can see that this discussion is really making people think. It was a question from Hassan Asmal, and he said, sorry, I got in late and I don't know if it was discussed, but what about inner city regeneration and more housing in inner cities? So I don't know if you want to, Lone, maybe you take 30 seconds and say something about that.
Well, I mean, I think Rihanna actually touched on that, you know, but I mean, I know Hassan's from Cape Town as well, and I think it's much more obvious in somewhere like Cape Town, where the mountain kind of separates, you know, the two parts of the two different sides of the city, but that's just being perpetuated, and there's a lot of resistance to changing changing the model that exists within the kind of inner city. I mean, there've been a lot of controversial projects there as well. I mean, the right to the city and the Woodstock protests and things like that as well, you know, where people seem to be continuing to be pushed out. But yeah, I mean, I think those are very big questions, obviously, that still need to be addressed. But just before you thank him, I just want to thank the 3 speakers for really interesting and diverse approaches and thinking around the city, and obviously it adds to the kind of complexity that we need to deal with. So thank you all.
Before I thank everyone, I just want to remind you of our next perspective, which is next Wednesday at the same time, starting at 4 o'clock. And it is how has COVID-19 impacted how we design urban spaces for live, work and play. Our chair will be Mpeti Moriele of MMA Design Studio, and our participants are Khalid Jacobs of Jakupa Architects and Urban Designers, Katie Ewing of UCT, and Sulam Mkabele of WITS. It promises to be just as exciting as today. I want to really thank Lone for her guidance conceptualizing this perspective series and for selecting this great panel. And a sincere thanks to Rihanna, Richard and Geshi. Rihanna for reminding us of our being human, reminding us to breathe, for Richard for helping us to visualize reality, and for Geshi for giving us a theoretical perspective and some thinking tools to move forward. You were all engaging and entertaining and introduced us to new perspective on urban development and prompted us to reflect on our approach and attitudes towards our work and our lives. I also want to thank all the behind the scenes organizers, Simon and Chelsea from STADIO, Yolanda representing the Architectural Education Forum Africa, and Brent from CIFA, who's organizing all the CPD. I also want to mention for those of you that are interested that today is the Desmond Tutu Peace Lecture, which always happens on his birthday. And this year deals with climate justice globally, now and for the future. And you will find a link on their website. It starts tonight at 7 o'clock if you're interested. And then thanks to everybody that attended the session and that took part and asked questions. It was really good having you here. If you filled in, when you registered the section for CPD, you will receive a certificate of participation soon. Thank you very much, and until next time.